Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Carla with Race to Walk, and I am here with Zak Schmoll to talk about his upcoming book, Disability and the Problem of Evil. So, whether you're joining us from the Facebook page for an unexpected journal, or my YouTube channel at Race to Walk, or Zak's YouTube channel, Race to Walk, thanks for joining us. And please type in the comments where you're watching from. So, anyway, I know Zak because we both graduated from the apologetics program at Houston Baptist University. When I started, he was almost done. He was actually the second cohort to graduate from that program. And he was in the first class that I took, which was film and visual arts. And I have to tell you this little story about Zak. So, Zak is very, very diligent, and he would always be the very, very first person to. We'd have to do weekly responses in Blackboard, and he would be always be the first person to respond. So one week, and I think this was actually the last week, I get there. There's no comments. There's no discussion, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to beat Zak this week. So my discussion, I post it, I refresh, and no, Zak once again beat me. So I never beat him for the discussion post, but he actually is. He graduated from the apologetics program with a master's in apologetics, and then he also has his PhD in humanities. But when he's not being the managing journal for us at an unexpected journal, he is a. So is it you're a commercial underwriter, insurance underwriter?
Yep.
Is that what it is?
Correct.
Okay. So that's his day job, but he is apologist in charge at an unexpected journal when he's not working there. But again, he's coming out with a new book called Disability and the Problem of Evil, and it is going to be, the launch date is scheduled right now for July 31st, which is his birthday. So you'll have to buy a book and say, happy birthday to Zak when you post a review on Amazon. So Zak, do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and about...
Sure. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Carla. This is a lot of fun. You and I did a live stream, man, just recently for an unexpected journal on superheroes, and that was a lot of fun. So I'm thrilled to be able to do it again. But yeah, so like Carla said, I think I'll maybe divide up who I am into a few different parts because it relates to my book title. So obviously, most of you wonder, why am I writing a book about disability? So I do have spinal muscular atrophy. I had it since it's genetic, so I've had it my entire life. I was diagnosed at 18 months, and it's a relative of muscular dystrophy, which you all might be more familiar with. And so I use a wheelchair, and largely, I've lived with these questions of disability for most of my life, but I didn't have the apologetic terms to talk about them, right? Because as I've been a Christian since I was a young child, I've read my Bible, I've gone to church, I've thought about these things, but I didn't necessarily have the vocabulary to be able to talk about really how to wrestle with these kind of life framing questions. Because a lot of times, disability is very central to someone's identity, right? It's a trait that seriously influences how you interact with the world around you, even in simple things or complicated things. Disability is not just a question of how will I get from my house to my job because I don't drive. It's also, how do I literally open the door to get to my car? So it's stuff like that. So the disability part of my line of thought has been going on for a long time, obviously. The problem of evil part was something I engaged at Houston Baptist University, and I thought this is one of those, and I would argue, probably the greatest challenge to Christianity from that non-believers may pose. I would I would argue that really, if you line up all the potential challenges to Christianity, it really is a serious concern of how is the God who's all powerful, all good, and all knowing? How does he allow problems in my life, right? Why can't he just take care of that? And so I got really interested in the problem of evil while I was studying at Houston Baptist. And then it came time to write my thesis. And from there, I thought, wow, I've been, interested in this question. My book, I interact a lot with Alvin Plantinga and his discussion of the free will defense, which I know we'll talk more about later. And I thought, wow, there's so much discussion about the problem of evil, but the questions I'm hearing in my life and from my friends are about disability, and there's really not a lot of Christian scholarship on this issue. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are plenty of fine writers who are working on it, so I don't mean to diminish their efforts in any way. That's not my intention here, but I think taking this challenge head on and trying to at least establish a framework and a vocabulary to talk about disability and the problem of evil might be useful. It was useful for my own thoughts to straighten them out and to put them on paper, but I hope it's useful to some other people too. So yeah, I guess that's a little bit about my background and why I'm, taking this challenge.
So you talk, can you just explain a little bit about, like, maybe for somebody who doesn't know what the term, the problem of evil, refers to, like, in a philosophical sense?
Sure. So yeah, the problem of evil, and it's been formulated in a variety of ways. Over time, because like I said, it's been kind of a critical question that a lot of people have wondered. And the formulation that I use in my book is one that was brought forward by a philosopher called J.L. Mackie. And what he said, and I'm quoting now, in its simple problem is this: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. So, from Mackey's formulation here, God is omnipotent, right? God is all powerful. So the question becomes, right? God could do anything that he wants. If God can do that, why doesn't God snap his fingers and all any problem, right? Not just disability. Why doesn't all evil go away? The next part, right? God is wholly good. Now we assume, right, that okay, if God wants what's best for me, it would be to take away my problems. And that's again from my human perspective, but I assume, and I don't think I'm alone in this, a lot of people might say, if this problem in my life was taken away, I would be better off. Now, again, disability might apply in that case, but it could be any problem, right? The problem of evil is more general than just disability. So you have that element as well. And then the third part, obviously, and yet evil exists, right? So Mackey's argument is you can't have it both ways here, right? You can't have a God who wants to do what's good, who can do what's good, and yet allows something bad to be there. That's kind of the problem of evil in a nutshell. And I do, it's not in this specific formulation, but there are others that talk about God being omniscient, right? God being all knowing. Because you could dodge and say, all right, God's all powerful, God's good, but maybe he's just unaware. Maybe God doesn't know. Well, obviously that doesn't work for the Christian, right? Because we believe in a God who is omniscient. And so we have this element, right, of God. We can't just say, oh, well, God doesn't realize, because then it's not our God. It's not the Christian God. So that's why this is a challenge for Christianity and other religions that have gods with certain characteristics.
So now, can you talk a little bit about how the book is structured, what you cover? Because some people may say, okay, well, this is written by somebody who is has a disability, So they may have an expectation that it's like all personal experience, and you do talk a little bit about your perspective, but it's actually written from a little bit different approach.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And it's funny because when I sent this to my editor right at the beginning, I had very little personal content in it. It said that, people might want to hear a little bit about you too. Um, so you know, I made the sacrifice and I added that in. But you're right. So, kind of to lead into the book, I do talk about kind of who I am, where I come from, why I have mainly the life experience to talk about this. Now, I mean, you can read my bio and my credentials and why I talk about apologetics and philosophy. But I think the bigger question is, why do I have any credibility to talk about disability? It's more that I've lived it and I understand it. And I think, and not that you can speak for the entire disability community as a block, but if you have some firsthand experience, I think that adds some appeal to certain readers who may be quick to write off someone who would say, "Oh well, you don't understand." Well,
Mm-hmm.
I do in some degree. So there is that. So I do start out with kind of the personal element, and then I've always found, and I mean, Carly, you know this too with apologetics. It's really important to define your terms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can talk right by each other if you don't know what you're talking about. So I spend a chapter defining disability because, I mean, you can open up your Oxford English Dictionary. But I talk about that a little, how the definition they have, while not bad, I mean, it's a broad definition, right? It talks about,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can apply to a broken down car, that it has a disabled engine, which is appropriate, but, not what we're talking about here. So we have a chapter on defining disability, a chapter on defining the problem of evil, which I kind of did for you all, although I go into a good deal more depth. And you might think at that point I dive right into solving the problem, but the thing is, I mean, Christianity has a very rich intellectual tradition, and I don't pretend to be the first one to ever talk about disability or the problem of evil. So I I provide an overview first of 3 different approaches that people have used to kind of solve the problem of evil. I provide some overview of kind of the biblical testimony and biblical perspectives on disability. I profile people like Job, people like honestly Jesus as our suffering Savior, who experienced an element of disability. I talk about Paul, who many scholars believe very well might have had a disability himself when he talks about his thorn in the flesh. He never quite plays out entirely what that is, but it's possible he had a disability himself. So I wrestle with the biblical perspectives on disability. Then again, like I said, the church has a rich tradition. So I talk about people like Martin Luther, who has an interesting record on disability. A little bit of a mixed bag with Martin Luther. Some people have taken his writings very offensively. I talk about John Calvin, talk about Soren Kierkegaard. I mean, we're all over the map here, but the point is, I'm trying to build a structure. So then, when we get to my last 2 chapters, you have all of this framework that I've built, and hopefully, then, and if I'm successful, I kind of walk you through and guide you to how a Christian worldview makes sense. We do not need to write off the existence of God because of the existence of disability. And I take a page from Plantinga here. He has a free will defense, right? So a defense is not a theodicy. A theodicy is a bit of a bolder claim, if you will. Um, it tries to explain why something is. A defense is more talking about, okay, there is a possible reason that God may have allowed a certain thing. So God may have allowed disability, I argue, for preserving human free will. And I unpack that. I add other elements. It's not nearly that simple. I know you've read my book, I go on about that for a while. But if there is a possible reason that God may have allowed disability, and it's consistent with his character of being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, or all good, then certainly at least the logical element of the problem of evil is not a problem anymore. And there's still emotional problems, right? Because understanding a logical proof isn't always very comforting, right? Um, like, people say, okay, I understand everything that you're saying, but it still hurts, right? It's still a challenge in my life. I'm still struggling with this. And so my purpose, and this kind of goes back to you asking about all about my personal experience. My conclusion is much more philosophical than personal/emotional. Um, I think I think number one that fits my topic better, but also I think it helps. I think it helps, when the emotions have quieted down, and when we take a pause and take a deep breath, then the arguments we can start to unpack. So I do think that's an important way to kind of conclude this book.
And I think that first you kind of have to have the foundation of, because emotions can take us anywhere. And so we can go all over the place. So you have to have, when you're in the middle, I think, of a trial or in a lot of pain, and this is for anything, there may be a time when you're just overwhelmed with the experience. But if all you have is experience and feelings, then you're always going to be left adrift. There has to be a foundation of, objective truth, a fact of reason that you can draw on and start to get to a stable foundation. So it may not in the immediate situation, it may not be something someone wants to hear, but it's something that they need to know, to really kind of come forward out of it. I think I'm going through Job right now in the Bible studies on my channel. And that's what it is. It's all about the problem of evil. And it's been really interesting because I'm going through verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and, spending that much time on it, you see the progression of him from, I am in complete despair. Nobody loves me. I'm better off dead. And it takes, that's chapter 3, and it takes to chapter 40 before he's really out of it. So I think that that's an illustration of how we are sometimes. You talk about in part of the book where that when you're training, like for sports, you're building muscle. It's not necessarily always pleasant, the exercises that you go through, but that's kind of the same way that we go through our life experiences. We're training up that spiritual and emotional muscle, this endurance and this persistence, because if we stay in our original state, we can't go any farther, really, I think.
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right. And that's what I mentioned earlier. There are kind of 3 general ways that people have addressed the problem of evil, right? And one of them is a soul-making theology, right? Some people would argue that if our walk is supposed to draw us closer to Jesus Christ, then maybe, just maybe, God allows evil in our lives to help push us along that path. Most of you know that I am a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and one of my examples is, Bilbo never would have left his hobbit hole if Gandalf didn't give him a little push out of the door. But what happened as a result of that? He developed character traits that he never would have developed otherwise. He became a better person because of what he went through. So there are that's one whole kind of division of how people have sought to address the problem of evil, because there are certain character traits like courage, right? How do you develop
Mhm.
courage if you never face adversity? How do you develop perseverance if you've never had kind of like an obstacle you had to overcome, right? So I think you're right on. There are definite elements of, and I think, and this is um, where it may get a little controversial. I think that some people will contend, okay, but why me, right? It goes back to Job. Why me? Um, what like because I like Job again. Show me where the evil is in my life, right? That was
Mhm.
Job's whole thing. Like, tell me, and um, I will, yeah, I'll admit it. I'm open to that. I'm not thinking that like I'm perfect, but tell me what I've done wrong. And I think that then brings up another whole wrestling with disability, right? I think that's a whole other question that we can go down if you want to, or we don't have to. And a nice comment. I love that. Um, but yeah, no, I'm very. I, I think it's very important for us to just remember that that is a possible explanation for why God allows disability. And a lot of theologians, I mentioned it's not necessarily not my conclusion in this book, but plenty of Christians have understood disability that way, and I think it's valid.
Yeah, a couple things. I've mentioned before that when I was in the apologetics program, I had the opportunity to take classes from William Lane Craig each semester. He would do um, a special topic, and the first one I took was on his book on guard. And so, if you know who William Lane Craig is, he is famous for the Kalam cosmological argument. We spent 3 days on that. 3 days. And finally, we get to day 4, Thursday. And it's the problem of evil. And I'm like, oh, finally something I get and I understand. It's like we all experience this and we all go through it. But a lot of times it's really hard to answer that, I think. And I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes we're not going to like the answer because, again, going back to Job, he in chapter 40, I think it is, he says, are you God? Do you understand all these things? So how can I possibly explain to you this situation when you don't even understand the things that are right in front of your face? Is basically what he's saying. So anyway, the other thing too is I think that so in on Unexpected Journal, we're an apologetics journal. We focus on cultural apologetics. And if someone watching this doesn't know what this is and you're familiar with, the William Lane Craigs or the Lee Strobels and their approach to it, it's different in that we discuss literature, we discuss movies, and we consider it cultural apologetics in that you have these discussions mediated through something that is a um, common element in culture that people understand. So, for example, Zach mentioned our last issue was on superheroes, and we have a lot of really great essays about what our love of superheroes says about us as human beings, what we can learn from them. But really, the problem of evil, I think somebody mentioned this as a topic when we were coming up for 2022, deciding on our list of topics. But the thing, it comes up in almost not all of them, but most of our issues, there's something about the problem of evil, like especially our summer issues, like when we did it on science fiction and film and
Mhm.
music. The film and music one was really, I mean, we're talking about really popular movies, but I mean, I would say that issue was probably our most evangelical or evangelistic issue out of all of
Yeah.
them because it's really dealing with evil. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I agree with you, and I think that's one other thing. I mean, disability is also something that most people experience on some level. And so I think even maybe if you haven't experienced living with some kind of maybe physical, mental, intellectual disability. I mean, it's people refer to the disability community as the largest minority in the world because at most times people will engage with it. So I think, I think there's a question, like you said, that these are kinds of questions that touch all of our lives. It touches our churches. And I mean, even, so I live in Vermont, for those of you who don't know. And so we have smaller churches here, but I've visited a bunch of churches, and in every church, there's someone who has some kind of disability. So even if it doesn't immediately apply to each individual person, if you broaden your circle just a little bit, it applies to just about everyone.
Well, I think that leads well into the next thing that we're going to talk about, and that is what can actually be an upside of evil. And we're going to talk about free will, which can be a very controversial topic in Christian circles. But one of the things that I have a couple quotes here. Let me see here. You discuss this quite a bit in your book, and on page 52, 53, you write, "Only by going through terrifying experiences can one learn courage. Only by persevering through pain can one develop endurance. Only by smiling when all instincts seem to force tears can one develop that inner strength to bless others, even when times get dark." I thought that was an awesome quote.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, I think that kind of, you mentioned like the upside of evil, right? And it all comes back to God's purpose in creating us, right? Why we are here. And our purpose is to glorify God. That's why we're here, to have a relationship with God and, to bring him glory. And I use the illustration throughout that, God could have created robots. He could have done that. Beings that would follow his will all the time without any independent thought or any independent choice. And I don't know how rewarding that would be. And I suggest, and Planting suggests, who I springboard off of, that a world with the existence of free will, with beings that make the choice to love God and choose to have a relationship with him and with each other, is intrinsically more valuable than a world full of robots. Now, the question then becomes, right, is that extra goodness, right, the amount better, that a world of free beings is better than a world of robots? Does that justify the amount of evil that comes about from the abuse of free will? I do not believe that God is, God is all good, therefore he is not evil. However, I believe that we as fallen people abuse the good gift that God gave us, and we do evil. I believe that Satan does evil. I believe that there certainly are many evil things that happen in the world. So you have to then consider that balance of, is the goodness of having a relationship with God and relationship with other people, is that goodness more beneficial than the amount of evil in the world? And the question then comes back to, again, God's chief purpose in creating us. I think that in creating us, I mean, we would not be able to fulfill that purpose, right? If we were robots, simply it just could not be done. We could not have that relationship with God, and we certainly could not show our love toward God if we were robots who had no choice in the matter. Love is a choice, and so I very much think that, again, given the character of God, if there was a better world, God would have created a better world. He certainly has the power to do so. So therefore, I think if God created the best world, which he did, that we have to come to the ultimate conclusion that free will and the ability to actually fulfill our purpose is a substantially great good and offsets all the evil. And the reward for us is that we get to know God and love him forever. And I talk about Revelation in one of my chapters. All the pain, all the suffering, all the tears are going to be wiped away. So even if you don't even care about anything I just said, even if you take just Revelation by itself, and then you consider that we are going to live in existence with God forever because of our relationship with him, our freely chosen relationship with God, then wow, billions and billions and billions and unknown billion number of years compared to 80 short years that are incredibly joyful, yet speckled with episodes of suffering. God is good forever. It just the balance, even from that one part, leaving out all the other elements of free will. Certainly, at least to me, and again to a lot of the Christian tradition, brings up that freedom, that ability to have that relationship that makes all of this possible, and is so valuable that it was worth the abuses of free will by some.
So this is a quote that you have on that, and it's a free world with great evil. Let me go into full screen on this. Is better than a robotic world without love. God is glorified in his beautiful relationships with his children. And that's one thing that has stood out to me as I've been going through Job, is that in the beginning, Job honored God, he worshiped God, but he didn't really have a relationship with him. He was living in this fear, and he understood God's greatness and majesty, but he didn't understand God's love for him. And it wasn't until going through all, losing everything, and really wrestling with the why, and having friends come, and some of their advice was good, some of it wasn't so good, but that it really forced him to develop that spiritual muscle, and really stand up and persist. And it's like with when Jacob, when he wrestled with God, that's what Job was doing emotionally. He was rising up and wrestling with God for an answer, and coming into relationship with him. But it was the trial that triggered that, really.
Absolutely. I think you're right on. And Job is so fascinating, right? Because God brings up Job in the first place, right? Have you considered my servant Job?
And like then, rubbing Satan's nose in it.
Yeah. And then Satan does all the evil. Like, God allows Satan to do it, but God is not the author of the evil. God is not saying, aha, I'm going to stick Job with all these sores, right? It's Satan who's choosing what evil trials are coming. God's allowing it. But then who restores it at the end? God restores it, right? So it's so amazing. Like, that relationship now plays out in so many wonderful ways that I think you're definitely right on that the relationship goes through the trial, and then at the end of it, we see Job kind of enjoying the blessing of God, and it was never a curse of God, it was a curse of Satan, but he enjoys the blessing of God.
That was that's one thing that's been, I guess I didn't really get this until I started going through it, that the book of Job is the oldest written book in the Bible. It's the oldest written book in the Bible, and it's really, there are other works about the same time that are similar, A man and his God, a dialogue between a man and his God. They're a similar sort of form. And so I think it's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting that the very oldest book that we have in the Bible is a question about the problem of evil. And and it's kind of like God's apologetic work. He works through the life of his people, right? It's cultural apologetics. And
Mm-hmm.
everything else in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, is an answer to those questions in the book of Job.
Mm.
It's like, why God? How is this going to work? Because this is what he says. It's like, how can a man be right with God? How can you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to forgive my sins? Whatever I do, it's always going to be a separation there. And so, beginning in Genesis, that's the answer. It starts the answer of this is how we're gonna bring this about. But
Well, you're right, and it ties in, right? Because Job, even like he longs for like a mediator, right? I don't
mhm,
understand this God, and
yeah,
you're right. The foreshadowing of the whole Bible, right there.
yeah, yeah. And I up until I started doing this, it was like right after Easter, and I was I don't know. Job has always been kind of a book I stayed away from because it's kind of like I always thought like Till We Have Faces is kind of a downer too. Like I reading the synopsis, it sounds kind of like depressing and weird. And that's one of my favorite books of C.S. Lewis now, but it's just there's so much in it, and you kind of have to like go like piece by piece to really see, okay, well, what is he really saying here? But the other thing that I was thinking of when you were talking is that people say, why can't God just fix it? Why can't God just
Hmm.
make it somewhere else? And it's this judgment of God, like you're not doing it good enough for me. I could come up with a better plan. But it's usually those same people would be very offended if God took away their own free will. Like if God just removed the ability for them to do a thing, they would be that wouldn't be right either. So it's
And
like
God,
if
oh, I'm sorry.
no, I was just gonna say, like, when you talk about wrongness, it's like literally he would have to remove the ability for free thought because Jesus says the evil starts in the thoughts.
Hmm. And you're right on because I mean you can't have free unfree beings, right? Can't be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you can have free will, but only when I mean God is omnipotent, but God still I mean, logic applies even in God's creation. You can't have free, unfree beings. You can't have a married bachelor, right? You can't have a square circle. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's very. I think it's very true. Um, what you were just saying. Like we always say, well, God, I don't. I can't believe. Let's use kind of a practical disability example. I can't believe you let that drunk driver drive and hit someone, and now they're injured with a spinal cord injury. God,
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe you would do that. And the the question then is, but how would God justly and fairly remove that person's free will without removing yours, without removing mine, um, and without removing our ability to love God and love each other? I don't see how that's possible. It's not just. And so again, it's back to that. There is evil in the world from the abuse of free will, I believe. However, the goodness of having a relationship with God and being able to enjoy Him forever is so great that it outweighs even all the evil that we see in front of us. And there's plenty of evil, right? Not just disability, but man, there's plenty of evil in the world to go around. So, how much greater must eternity with God be? And even honestly, being in a relationship with God here, how much greater
Mm-hmm.
should that be? Maybe we don't always embrace our relationship with God or appreciate it as much as we ought to.
Yeah, and that I think that brings up a good point. It's like we so often we don't appreciate it. Even as Christians who say that we believe in God and trust in Jesus as our Savior and believe that He is the Savior of the world, I don't think that we always appreciate the blessings that He's given us. And so these things that happen, I how many more things could have happened that you aren't even aware of. So
Yeah.
Job was, Satan's complaint to God was, I haven't been able to touch him. because you have a hedge of protection around him. So how
Mm-hmm.
many of us have hedges or been protected by things that we don't even know, that until we get to heaven and see all the things that were going on, we will never know how many things God protected us from. I mean, when I remember one time I was driving back from San Antonio, it was just me and my girls, and I just felt like, okay, I should pull off to the side. And right after that, the tire blew out on my car. Pulled off on this road. This man drove up, and then right after him came this couple. They got out, and so it wasn't just me with this woman. The guy went and was fixing everything. She stood there, prayed with me. I mean, you just don't even know. I mean, you have no idea the things that could have happened, and we don't know what our life would be like if it weren't for the continual presence and protection and blessing of God. And there's so many times. I mean, I remember when I was in the class on scriptural apologetics with Michael Kona, he asked about miracles. You know, there's this, and the stories that people had about the the protection of God in that were giving the responses. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
had what I've considered a pretty wild miracle story. Mine was nothing compared to some of the experiences that other people had about God protecting them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. And actually, it's something I wrestle with in the book because, okay, I assume, well, I'm saying I hypothetically here, but okay, so let's say I'm unhappy with my condition of having a disability. Let's say which I'm actually pretty okay with it, but let's say I'm not okay with it. How I have no idea how my life has been shaped by even the condition I find myself in. So, like in my book, I wrestle with, and I'm pretty sure I tell this story. I've told the story plenty of other places if I don't in my book, but I'm pretty confident that if I had been a little kid and I had been able to run and walk and do all of that, I think I would have spent a lot more time on the basketball court. I think I would have spent a lot more time on the baseball field than I did reading books. I love to read books, don't get me wrong, but just my natural inclinations, I'm pretty confident. I might not have studied as hard as I should have. That wasn't my life, though. That wasn't how I turned out. And so I think that maybe there's some element there of, the person I became, I found a lot of other things that I loved because of not being able to run to practice every night, I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't, and so it's really hard to automatically assume, oh man, my life would have been so much better. If I didn't have that disability, I would have been in the NBA. I would have been so awesome. I'm also 5'1", so the NBA probably would not be in my future. But it's one of those things where it's very much it's a, like, we always assume, right, the grass greener on the other side. But
Mm-hmm.
man, like I, I my life has been great. I found things I love to do. I mean, we do the journal. We've done a lot of work on that with some great people. I probably, and who knows? I mean, maybe I would have been a terrible baseball player, and I would have realized that books really are for me, and maybe my trajectory would have been very similar. Who knows? But it's that assumption, right? That we're dissatisfied with our state. We assume that we know better than God, and then, but it's based on limited knowledge. We don't have a clear vision of any of it. Yeah, it's not within our. We can't. One of my history professors in undergraduate used to talk about counterfactual speculation. You can't. And he was warned us against doing that when we were trying to understand history. And I think that applies to our own lives too. I can speculate, but I only know the facts about my life, and I know how God has worked and the person I've become. So again, like I said, I'm not incredibly dissatisfied with my life or anything like that. But you know, even for people who maybe are struggling with that, I think that would be my encouragement to you is to not automatically assume that the grass is always greener on the other side. In fact, if you're a Christian, struggling with this, I would encourage you to consider that God is providential, and God has your good in mind. So I would venture to guess that probably the grass would not be greener on the other side. If there was somewhere better for God to have put you, if He is good, that's where He would have put you. So I think ultimately the question comes back to this objective truth that we talked about earlier. Is it possible that God can have all of these characteristics? If that's true, and it is possible for evil to exist as like another part of reality, as long as the existence of evil does not absolutely disprove the existence of God, then there is no problem of evil. There's still the emotional wrestling, like we've been talking about a lot today. But if we can have that objective bedrock truth that no, God exists and evil exists, both are true, and now we have to try to make sense of it. That's okay. We don't have to deny God. We don't have to say, oh, well, automatically now I know that God doesn't exist because if He did, I would never be in this situation.
Yeah, I think that it really goes back to a matter of trust, right? And who we think God is. And if we think that He loves us and cares for us. Because, like, going back again to Job knew that God was great. He knew He was almighty, but he didn't really have that understanding of God's great love for him. And you see that we're on in the Bible study that I'm working through, we're on chapter 10. So that's where he's at right now. But that's one of the things, it's Paul, right, that says we have to understand how wide, how high, how deep God's love is for us. And I think that, with any situation, if you're going through a trial, the first thing is you have to remember that, God is good and He loves you. And it may be a trial that you're coming through, and it may be a trial that God is going through with you through it. And so I think the significant thing about Paul is he had something. We don't know what it was, but there was something that he was asking God for. And he didn't say, okay, I'm just going to sit here and take it. He asked God 3 times for him to be taken from him. And he said, my grace is made perfect in weakness. So I think a lot of times, personally, we go through trials and we sit there because we think God's like Job, He's not going to answer me and He doesn't care what I'm going through. If you've been told 3 times no by God, then accept the answer. But if you haven't gone that far, then keep persisting. There's always the parable of the persistent widow, right? He said, keep on knocking, and you'll receive. Like if you are who are human and who are sinful know how to give your children good gifts, how much more can your heavenly Father give you good gifts? But it has to come from a place of we're trusting in God wherever it ends up. Wherever it ends up, you have to believe in God and say, okay, God, whatever you want for me, I'm good with. But I am, guide me in your will. Give me a heart for what your will is for me. I think that this is a really, I was just going to add your quote here, which I thought was really awesome. As the evil seems to become more and more powerful, hope seems to diminish and feelings of abandonment grow. It is easy to ask God for a particular answer to prayer, but it is much harder to wait for the response or not receive the desired solution.
Yeah, and I'm not. I'm not going to lie to all of you out there in internet land. There have been times where I've prayed, God, will you take this away from me? I'm in a good place now, but I'm not going to lie to you all. I certainly have been there. And so there is a very real element, but I think you hit the nail on the head there that we need to remember, right? It's God's will, and God, wherever this is going to end up, like that's what I need to trust you for. So I think that's, with Paul, right? Clearly, it was not God's will to remove that thorn, whatever it was. And for some people, and you see like in Acts, you see the miracle accounts, it
Mm-hmm.
was God's will that certain people were made to walk or blind to see. Yeah, Jesus healed the blind man, right? So there are times where it is God's will, and there are other times where it is not. But all of that does not impinge on the goodness of God, and that's critical from a Christian theological perspective, right? And that's where kind of the challenge to the Christian faith, the problem of evil, comes in, right? Well, Jesus healed, that person. Well, why didn't he heal this person over there? Jesus didn't heal everybody, presumably, with a disability in the Middle East. He walked around and he healed certain people he saw. For all we know, and we don't know, maybe there were some people Jesus chose not to heal. Maybe he didn't. I don't want to speculate further than the text says. We know he at least healed some. And
Well,
there
it
were
said that
presumably,
he healed all who
sorry,
came to him.
right,
He
all who
healed
came to
everyone
him,
who came. Yeah. So he
right.
didn't turn away anyone who came to him. But yeah, I
But
don't know.
yeah,
It's an
it
interesting question.
yeah, it's not like disability disappeared in the Middle East, right? Because Jesus was there. He could have, but he didn't.
Hmm.
It's interesting.
So we're going to move into our last section, and this is more about like the response to disability. So you mentioned that you live in Vermont and you've been in your church home for your entire life. So, what are some things that you would say that your church specifically has done that has been not only helpful to you as a person, but like to your family?
Yeah, so it's interesting because yes, shout out to Webster Baptist Church if you're all listening. But yeah, it's interesting because our you know it, when I think about how my church family has embraced me, I think, and this is gonna sound weird, but one of the best things for me is that number one, people are willing to help when they see a need, but number two, people don't impose if I don't ask, which
Hmm.
I personally appreciate. Right, that may be just me personally, but I I appreciate the um, obviously people are more than willing to help. I mean, when I was a small child, we did not have an elevator in my church. We didn't need one. No one used one. Now, they didn't put it in just for me by any means, but I benefited from them putting it in, and it was the right decision. Our sanctuary is on the second floor. Uh, and so, again, there are decisions like that, certainly, that I can point to and say, oh, my church has made accommodations. Another thing that doesn't really apply to me, but we've had individuals come who are deaf, and we've been able to provide ASL. Um, we have people in the church who know ASL, and that's been a blessing to people who have come. Now, we uh, don't have any regular members who require ASL, but it's an option that we can make available to people if they, which is good. So beyond those kind of straightforward, like, well, I want to say physical accommodations, maybe that's not the right word, but those material kind of things. I think the biggest thing that churches do well when trying to, and I've heard this from other people in other churches too, is like I said, people are willing to help when you ask for it, and they don't impose when you don't ask for it, right? Um, I think, and with the disability or not, I think we all can relate to a situation where you
Hmm.
have people who they think they're helping you, but they're not really helping you, right? Their help is a little
Hmm.
bit overbearing, and you're like, okay, just back off, I'm okay, right? And so I think it's a fine balance, specifically when dealing with disability, because there are certain things. If you were hanging out with me, you would find out that there are certain things I can't do, and you learn to to open the door to help me get through it. I ask, I say, "Hey, can you get the door?" Oh, sure. And I very much appreciate that help. But um, I think that's one of the best things, like in terms of attitudinally from our church, that I very much appreciate is I'm I'm treated just like everyone else. People love me. Well, they love each other too. It's part of the family. And so that's what I very much appreciate. That, you know, it, there's a phrase that goes around the internet, some in like disability circles, and they call it inspiration porn,
Mm-hmm.
which is essentially using disability as kind of like, oh, you're so heroic. And it's like, well, because I went to the grocery store, like, why am I
Mm-hmm.
heroic, right? Like, yeah, you take praise when it's deserved, but not for doing something like that everyone else does. And so I think that's one thing that I very much appreciate that, um, I, why did I teach a young adult Sunday school class? Um, well, I don't think it was because I'm in a wheelchair, but because I had something to say and I had the ability to teach. So it wasn't like I just appreciate very much being like help when I need it. People are more than willing to help with whatever I need, but also not being overbearing. That's a huge, and I think that sometimes scares away. I'm part of some Facebook groups, right, for people with disabilities, and um, some of them talk about church and their experiences in church. Sometimes people get scared away, right? When it's a good impulse, right, to want to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, there's a fine line between offering help when it's requested and offering help that maybe is a bit overbearing.
So the other question I have is, so your book doesn't really deal with the pastoral approach. You're coming from the philosophical
Mhm.
view of the problem of evil. But if someone was in charge, leadership in a church, and they were reading your book and kind of getting a little bit of a grasp on kind of some of the issues, what are some of the biggest ways that you think that the church needs to improve in helping or in serving, administering to people who have disabilities?
Yeah, that's a huge question and a really good one. One thing that's really challenging, and I say this critically but hesitatingly, because I understand the realities of church budgets and things like that, and I realize
Mm-hmm.
most of our churches are not getting rich. Um, but physical access, a lot of churches are old. They were built pre ADA. They're not required to be accessible. Um, Great, they're not required, but they should be. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not that you're being told by the government, but as a matter of being able to minister to everyone, physical access should be a priority, even if the government's not threatening to fine you. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one obvious thing. Um, Also, I mean, I know a lot of parents, and especially, and I I talk mostly about physical disability because that's where I'm from. That's what I know. But I know a lot of parents, especially with children who maybe have some, um, let's say intellectual disabilities or emotional disorders. It it can be a challenge sometimes um, when, let's say, your regular Sunday school class uh, doesn't quite work, right? Because the child can't
Mm-hmm.
sit still for a half hour or 45 minutes or however long your time is. Um, and yet, I mean, they the child needs to hear God's word too, and the parents, should have the ability to attend classes they want to as well. So I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
really practical thing that churches could do, is to try to help build in those supports, specifically for parents and children. I suppose for anyone, but to say, all right, hey, we have a resource here. If your child needs, maybe more supervision for whatever reason, um, we can help you with that so that you can attend class and they can attend class and everyone, can learn more about Jesus. I mean, that's why we're here. So, I mean, I know when we were young, my sister was an assistant in our children's program, and I mean that was a big thing that she wasn't the teacher, but she helped with some kids who were a little wilder sometimes, but that was her job, was to kind of help support that role. So I think that's another practical way that we can, churches can think about is, okay, if this child cannot, sit still in Sunday school for an hour, the parent may feel bad about that and may pull their whole family from Sunday school and from attending church. And that's not what any of us want. So how can we support to help make that possible? I think that's a critical thing, is trying to be proactive and think, okay, is there a barrier here that would prevent, that would that people might not think to ask about? The parents probably want to impose, right? The parents would say, "Oh, well, I can't ask somebody to watch my child," but if it's maybe a proactive service that they can inquire about, then they might,
Mhm.
and that's good.
Well, awesome. Well, we are actually right at an hour. So we've been talking about Zak's upcoming book, Disability and the Problem of Evil. And again, you can go to his website at zacharydschmoll.com and learn more about like when this book is coming out, as well as some of his other work. And it is scheduled to be available on July 31st. So, anyway, so be looking forward to that. But thanks for joining us so much today. And we hope that this has been helpful to you and hopefully, hopefully encouraging too. And thanks, Kelly. Kelly is actually the owner of Public Philosophy Press. So, anyway, but I'm really excited about this coming out. And again, thanks for joining us. And um, we
Oh,
hope that this
that,
has been helpful
that's our
today.
pastor's wife, if you're wondering.
Okay,
Hi, Diana.
awesome. Well, thanks for watching. And if you've enjoyed this video, please share it with a friend, and also share Zak's book with a friend when it comes out. But thanks for joining us today, and we will see you all next time.